So now let's get today's event started. Game-based learning ROI using Bloom's taxonomy to assess impact with Ellen Johnson. Ellen, welcome back to Training Magazine Network.
It's great to be back. Can everyone hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Perfect. Okay. I'm getting some thumbs up. I love it. I feel like this is a new emoji experience for me, where they're floating. I haven't seen that in Adobe Connect, and I think that's just because I don't use this platform very much. But anyway, I'm really glad that you all joined us today to have this conversation. Whenever I get the chance to talk about game-based learning, I think there's just a ton of enthusiasm for the topic, but it always gets a little sticky, which actually is fun, I think, in a way, because if we have lots of options, there's lots of discussion to be had. So I'm really excited to kind of engage our brains together today. Just a little bit of background on me and why I'm talking about this. So I've been in the L&D space for over 15 years now in various roles, but I've been working in game-based learning design for a good 10 years or so. These are just a handful of some of the game-based projects that I've worked on. You can see all of these are digital. We've done some in-person game projects as well, but they're not going to all fit on a slide in a nice, satisfying way. The other thing that I wanted to kind of lay out here is that I also tend to try to fit in some indie game development on the side. So I share this because I just wanted to let you know I think about games a lot. I think about how to design them a lot. Apparently, I can't stop thinking about them because I've made it my job and my hobby. So I want to bring some of that experience and some of those kind of parallel perspectives to our conversation today and share with you just a way of talking about game-based learning that you might find useful in the roles that you have in helping to engage learners and helping to provide real value. So I've had countless learning experiences through playing games. One of the most memorable ones for me was one of my first playthroughs of the game Super Metroid. This is a Super Nintendo game, one of the just the classic Nintendo games that people talk about in terms of how it shaped design. And this is a moment where you meet the Dakora bird or Dachora bird. I'm not sure how it's actually supposed to be pronounced. Doesn't really matter because you don't talk in the game. As a player, I was going through the tunnels and I discovered this neat bird. And by trying to mimic its movements, I learned a new, very cool skill. Um, for me, the overall just experience of learning and mastering gameplay is very captivating. It's why I play games, and it's one of the big reasons why I love working in L&D because we get to learn new stuff all the time, and you get to experience that flow state. You get to experience that kind of the beginning arc of what it means to learn something new and then start to master it, and then you're done and you move on to the next project. But if you love the beginning of that curve, then working in L&D can be particularly great. And playing games can be particularly great because you get to experience that over and over again. So I think if you're here, my assumption is you probably feel the same way that I do, and that games can be a vector for really powerful learning experiences. In fact, that games are learning experiences. So I'm not really going to focus on the why of games for instruction today. Instead, I'm going to really focus on the mental tools we need to be able to communicate that value within our context, right? We're not here as practitioners of game design in the entertainment games industry. We are here as practitioners of learning experience design and learning strategy and L&D leadership, so on and so forth. Really different spaces, even if they might rely on some of the same basic interactivity, at least the way that you code it into the computer. The way we're using it, the way we need to think about how it generates value is wildly different. And therefore, we need different language to be able to explain it. Um, that language is sometimes a sticking point, right? So I want to share with you kind of a process today using Bloom's taxonomy as a bit of a mental lens that I have found valuable in talking about how games relate to learning in that organizational context. Cool. Okay, so let's just see before we really dive into it. I want to get a sense of where you all are in your journey. So we have a couple of poll questions for you that are popping up on the screen. First, I want to know who's your main audience? Who's in our audience today? Are you focused on corporate employees? Are you looking on trying to train customer facing teams? Are you in leadership and management? Are you really trying to get compliance and safety teams? And these are really loose categories, right? There might be some things that aren't really well represented, and that's okay. We're just looking for broad generalizations. Question
A-
2, yes.
And yeah, I'm just want to point out they can select all that apply, of course,
Yes.
for both of these. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out, Philip, right? Because so many of us are like the one-stop shop of our organization's L&D. And so you're not just serving one audience, you're potentially serving multiple audiences. So yeah, yeah, I know. It's really appropriate that that laughing emoji also has tears. I think we all feel that a little bit. Um, okay, I also want to know what's piquing your interest, right? And you can multiple select on this question too. So what do we have? I'm seeing just kind of in the responses here, it looks like the majority of our selections for our main audience question were on corporate employees, and there might be some duplicate selections here, which is great. We have a good number of people looking at customer facing teams, technical or skilled labor roles, little bit less on compliance and safety teams, and we also have some other, which hopefully we're seeing people share in chat. Technicians that monitor phone lines, state government, higher ed teaching faculty, yes, students for research. Okay, fascinating. This is really cool. What's piquing your interest in game-based learning today? We've got 2, maybe 3 really leading responses. Someone who's doing education or training in the military. Fantastic. Engaging learners more effectively. Great. We've got creative and fun learning format. Yes, absolutely. Especially if you're working with an audience that's very used to like death by PowerPoint, this can feel like a breath of fresh air, even if you're only just able to sprinkle it in a little bit. Better retention and skill application. I'm so glad I've seen, so many of you responding with that as one of your selections, because I think if we really open our mind about what games can be, it really unlocks a lot of possibilities for how we can cultivate skills and help people retain them and develop them over time. Benjamin said he wants an excuse to play D&D at work. I hope we give you the tools that you need to live your dream. Let us know how it turns out. And Mark Shepard suggested Roll20. Great application. I can't get distracted about D&D though. Okay, this is really great. I'm glad to see where you're all coming from, and I'm glad to see that there isn't anybody kind of on an island. So hopefully, as you're using the chat and we're doing some of our group activity work later, you're able to see some similar perspectives echoed in the responses, and you can take some of that group learning and bring it back to your own specific organization. Super duper. Okay. Bloom's cognitive taxonomy is probably something that as L&D professionals, we are all somewhat familiar with. Um, we're not going to talk about the details of the taxonomy. It's just a framework, again, to kind of set up this idea of this mental lens that we can use to cultivate the language that we want to communicate. Um, the language of the business, right? The ROI. So we're going to use the taxonomy as that lens that enables us to examine our goals instructionally and also examine gameplay to see where alignment can happen and then make that communication to the business leaders around us who aren't necessarily the exact same flavor of nerd that we are. Okay, so the way that we're going to do that, I first want to talk about the language and why I think it's important that we think about that and what specifically we're looking for. Then we're going to go through an exercise where we actually look at how to describe gameplay with the taxonomy, and we're going to be using Minecraft to think through that. We're going to do a group activity, and then we'll set aside a good chunk of time for discussion and for questions at the end, too. Now, that doesn't mean don't ask questions. I see that we have one question from Jen already. What's the name of the podcast? Nice Games Club is the name of the podcast. So you can look that up. And there's just a whole bunch of resources there for making games and interviews and so on and so forth. I try to work in as much L&D as I'm able to. Do I use the original Bloom or the later one modified by others? I think I'm using the later one right now, but ultimately it's not so much about the version. It's about how it opens up your way of thinking about language. So this is great. Okay, we've got some questions. You've kind of seen how we might answer some questions throughout the show today. But for sure, we're going to try to carve out some time towards the end to do a more focused Q&A. But if you have questions, pop them in there and we'll try to answer them as we go. Okay, so when it comes to game-based learning and gamification, two separate terms, but it gets really confusing with the information out there, right? If you're trying to get information about how game-based learning or gamification might provide value to your organization, it is really hard to get good information. There's a lot of hype pieces out there. There are old statistics. There's conflicting and overlapping terms in the research reporting. Are they only talking about gamification? Are they also talking about game-based learning? Are they using those two terms in the same way that I understand them? It's really hard to make sense of it. And when you see all these very positive statistics like 90% and 80%, it kind of makes you wonder, like, what are we actually looking at here, right? Um, and so there is a lot of promising information and research available, but it's hard to find, it's hard to parse, and it's also typically very generalized. So it's hard to find good information about how game-based learning would perform within a specific context, right? You can find something that might have something to do with a segment of your audience, but is it the same context that you're working in? Probably not. And so a lot of the information that is out there that is high quality isn't necessarily specific to the context in which we're working, right? Within organizations of various sizes, within and with populations of, various segments. There's just a lot of information out there and it's hard to find out what's applicable. My thinking here is that we have a lot of thinking, a lot of feeling, a lot of research saying that there's promise in this area, but not a lot of it that specifically applies to us in our individual roles. So, how do we bridge that gap? Obviously, we want to do more. We want to do better by our learners, and we're always looking for ways to do that. But to do more or to at least change direction, we need support from the organization. We need buy in. And without a clear connection between our planned learning initiatives and the business or organizational ROI, we're not going to get that support. We're not going to get that buy in. So, my thinking is yes, we want to be looking at what the research is telling us. We want to make sure that our directions are designed, are based in what can be, illustrated to work. But also, we need to think about getting information from our own organizations, right? Because that's going to actually help us focus on what's beneficial for our specific audiences. Okay, so that brings us to where we're talking about language, right? In order to make that very specific, very contextual connection, we need to get more specific and meaningful in the language we use to explain it. Okay, so let's look at some examples. Um, this is language that wouldn't make sense in the organizational context where we typically are. This is the language that games use to describe themselves. When you go out to the Nintendo eShop or you're going to Steam or you're going to the PlayStation store, you're seeing terms that describe genres. You're hearing terms that describe features or the aesthetics of a game. Something like open world or action adventure, detailed physics engine. For me, a big selling point of Breath of the Wild was it had horses in it, right? No one really cares unless you're involved in some sort of horse related business if there are horses in your learning game. Another game that I really like, probably haven't heard of, it's called Thoth. It's very abstract. You're a square that shoots things and shapes and you fight shapes. It's very bizarre. Minimalist, cosmic horror, twin stick shooter, co op mode. These things don't mean anything in terms of business ROI, but it's the language we typically see when we're talking about what games are like. Okay, so that's one set of language we're going to set aside. It's not useful for us. What we typically do in L&D when we start using games in our programs is we talk about it in very general language, right? We talk about types and categories. We're going to do a scavenger hunt as part of our onboarding. We're going to do charades as a team building exercise. We're going to add a trivia game to our e-learning. We might do an escape room, or we might set up some sort of digital race, or maybe we're going to make a puzzle. These are types and categories. They still don't speak to the value because they don't speak to, oh, yep, I didn't go. There we go. I selected the wrong screen. You guys are seeing what I'm talking to now. Okay. These terms, they speak to kind of what the game experience will be like, but they still don't speak to what the value is going to be for the organization, right? So we can work a scavenger hunt into onboarding. We can work a trivia game into an e-learning. It's not to say it's bad to use these games necessarily. That's a different discussion. And Scott, I think, is having some of that discussion in the chat right now. But at the very least, if this is as far as we go with how we think about and describe games, then we are leaving an entire continent of options untouched because we're thinking about games in only this kind of very generic type-based way. Okay. Some really great comments in the chat. I'm glad you guys are having a good time. Okay, so instead of talking about types and categories or features and aesthetics, I want us to use our verbs. And this is where Bloom's taxonomy starts to come in, right? So let's talk about the language of the organization. These are just a couple examples of quotes that I pulled from executives that have been talking out in the news. You can find this language anywhere. And these are business executives of large organizations, right? So I think I pulled one from Perfect Moment. They're kind of a luxury clothing brand company. I can't speak to them very much in detail, and that's not really the point. The one on the right here is right from Microsoft, right? And this is Microsoft leadership talking about what they're aiming to do with their business in 2025. I've highlighted all the verbs here. This is how business leaders use active language. They're using verb this, they're using verb that. And this is language that many of us are already familiar with, but we've been kind of coached sometimes not to use that part of our lexicon in the business because it's jargon. I think it can be jargon, but I also think it's something that we can use, remix a bit, and then really use to explain value. Ultimately, it's more meaningful to describe learning experiences this way because these words relate to the cognitive processes and the behaviors that we need rather than gameplay or genre. So we do have to make sure that cognitive processes and behaviors that we're considering during training align with organizational goals. That is our job, right? It is our job as designers of learning experiences, managers and directors to make sure that there is close alignment. That is how we provide value. And by using this type of language, this is how we tell the story of how we provide value. Okay, so I recognize this can be a little bit of a leap for some of us. I think we're conditioned to think about learning in a very specific sort of way during our years of schooling and any mountains of content focused training that we may have had to take over the years. We've been conditioned to think about learning experiences as kind of like a schedule or as like a course, right? We move through the education system in a very topical fashion. Even current business content libraries are organized by topic. Although I think they're getting better at explaining upfront what the value of a given course will be to the learner and to the organization. Yes, Matthew, you teach as you were taught, right? And it makes sense. That's how our brains are working. That's how they work. So we have to think about how to remix it a little bit when we're doing it for a different context. What I'm suggesting is that when we think about games for learning purposes, we activate those verbs the same way we would when we're thinking about designing and starting with performance objectives or learning objectives, right? And this is where we can use that tool, that language, to find where things can overlap. This topic oriented experience can make it tough for us to translate the active nature of games into the vocabulary that really makes sense for leaders. One way to think about it is if you've ever played like a Zelda game, hopefully many of you have. If you haven't, you're missing out. You didn't think, oh, this geometry game is so much fun. Even though it is fundamentally like a geometry game. It's made of 3D geometric shapes that you're manipulating using a physics engine, and you're going to do it to solve puzzles. You're going to roll a ball down this angle and it's going to hit over there. It's a geometry game. It's a physics puzzle. But we don't think of it that way. We're just focused on the story and on the adventure. Okay, so let's look at how we can use the taxonomy to function as this lens that will help us connect the different sides of this triangle, right? We have the business needs on one end, we have the game play on the other end, and we need to make sure that there is alignment in the learning application in the middle. Okay, so here is a quarterly business objective from a fictional manufacturer of laboratory equipment. There is no actual product called the Beamser 3000, alas. My question for you all, which you can answer in chat, is this similar to any business objectives or organizational goals you've seen communicated by the leaders that you work with? Okay, I'm seeing some yeses. Absolutely. Okay, some thumbs up. Excellent. Okay, great. Okay, I'm really curious about the no's. I hope that you get some clear objectives from your business leaders, from your organizational leaders. Let's use this just as an example for now, and we'll kind of see this evolve step by step. Okay, getting some more context for the nose. This is helpful. For this worked objective or this worked example, let's talk about now how this might be formed into a learning objective that relates to the organizational objective. So if we imagine this as our organizational objective, every department, every division is thinking about how to make this a reality. We're working with our tool set in the learning and development space in the training department. We might create a program, and within that program we have something that has this learning objective. Understand the features that distinguish the Beamser 3000 from other leading scanners on the market. Yes, Joel, that is what I was saying. Joel's seeing where I'm going. Okay. Have you seen learning objectives like this one? Is it a good learning objective? Is another follow-up question. Okay, Melissa says yes with a capital letters. Nicole says it's not a good one. Bad objective. No understand. Yes. I'm so glad. Don't use understand. Not measurable. Exactly. You can't right. You cannot measure understand. Okay, great. Chuck Norris will roundhouse kick any learning objective that begins with other understand. I kind of wish that we had a Chuck Norris GIF now because it would be great to pull it up at this point. I'll have to think ahead to the next webinar. Okay. Yes, it's not a great learning objective. You can't measure it. You can't observe it. Let's move past that for now. It's not a good one. We should be able to grab something that's better and more observable. And if you do that at this level, it's going to make the next step even easier because the next step is thinking about gameplay. So if we think about this as 3 separate layers, ideally, the verb under the gameplay objective is the same verb that you have under the learning objective. It doesn't have to be to make this work. You just have to get more specific. So if someone's giving you learning objectives or you're starting with ones that are kind of vague and unmeasurable, like understand, you can use this tool to go a level deeper and think, okay, how do we get to something observable? And the interesting thing is when you have something observable, you can make it a game mechanic. How do you identify something in an online game? You click on it or you move it around some way. You can build mechanics around this, or you can identify games that already have mechanics that align with what you're trying to measure. Great. Okay. So this is what I mean by using it as a lens, right? We can use the Bloom's taxonomy to think about the different levels of the taxonomy, and then we can use all the different verbs that various models of the taxonomy give us to pinpoint promising gameplay. It's a lot of P's. I didn't mean for that alliteration to happen, but I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so let's think aloud for a second. We'll just pause here for a moment. Think aloud in chat. Um, Can you imagine the gameplay described here? We describe it here as, let's imagine 6 laboratory processes that are upgraded by the Beamser 3000, and you have to go through this hidden object game to identify where they are. Is that a gameplay we can quickly imagine in our heads visually? How long would it take learners to complete? Yeah, okay. Some of you are saying, yes, you can. Would this be something that would take a lot of time for learners to complete? Maybe not. How much would it cost to create? Depends on what tools are available to you. I think, one thing we can talk about later on in the session is how there are lots of tools coming out that make the creation of very rich media a lot faster and cheaper than it used to be. I'm curious how, in this particular worked example, how the scanner company's L&D team could point to ROI around this gameplay, right? And I want to talk through that a little bit. Oh yeah, give it a time limit. If it's how is lab process made visual? Now that's really interesting. I really like what John asked there. Because yes, right, you have to do some prototyping and thinking, okay, how do we make a lab process visual? Is it something that you can create a story around? If you think about the show don't tell, could you create like some sketches on a whiteboard that seem to like make that visible? Can you replace some common lab equipment with something else to make it seem like, okay, this has been different? You know, You'd have to prototype this and actually see what it would work. This isn't a real device. We don't actually have a game like this. Just an example of where this takes you and how rapidly you can get from one thing to the next. Okay. So Joel was asking, you seem to go back and forth from training to development and back to training. They're not the same. So we might have to do a follow-up on that, Joel. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that and we could come back to it. Okay. For now, I want to move on to the very detailed look into a specific game. Then we can move on to our group exercise. Okay, so we talked a little bit about objectives, moving to organizational objectives, um, moving to learning objectives, moving to describing gameplay with active language. I want to take us kind of through the taxonomy from bottom to top, just so we can look at a specific game that maybe many of us are familiar with, and we can see how we can use those verbs to describe aspects of gameplay. And this is really just the intention behind this journey is to show where we're looking at the game to get this type of language. And this is a way that you can think about it, so you can look at existing games and how they might work, or you can look at existing games as inspiration for something that you might create. Okay. So we already know this, I think, pretty well, but just as a kind of a reminder, the way that we're thinking about this, and again, this is just a model. The bottom of the pyramid, which is kind of a step here, is the less complex thinking, and the top is more complex thinking. There's a lot of debate, I think, to be had about how accurate that is. Again, we're using this because it gives us useful language. It's a nice, useful heuristic as part of this process. Okay, so again, I think to illustrate this, to kind of go through this journey from remembering all the way to creating, we're going to go into Minecraft, because this particular great game really allows you to engage with all of those different kinds of processes within the same gameplay or within the same game. Okay, so if you've played Minecraft, there might be some moments that you recognize here. If you haven't played Minecraft, hopefully you're at least familiar with what it is, but I'll explain a little bit about what's happening in each of these screenshots so everyone can follow along. Okay, so this is a screenshot from the very beginning of a new game. You don't have much for your player. You're looking at your player, you're looking at your inventory, and you don't really have anything. The remembering level, right? That we're just thinking about recalling information. Can you find stuff in the USB stick of your head? There's not a lot of stuff happening here. It's foundational. I think this is, for me, one of the types of gameplay that I see applied most often in the training space, in the learning and development space. Um, but I also think it's one of the least interesting from a gameplay perspective. Um, you can remember that you use buttons on the mouse and the keyboard to interact with the game. You've got that, right? You're learning the interface. You recall that you can access an inventory tool. When we're thinking and playing, we kind of breeze past these because I think it happens mostly automatically. Some of that is because of good user interface design. This is a very basic level of gameplay, bottom level of the taxonomy. Okay, let's move up to understand. Difficult to measure, understand on its own, right? You have to connect it with something that you can measure, that you can observe. Within this game, when we're thinking about understanding, the things around you that you're observing in the game start to gain significance. You're connecting facts, ideas, and concepts. You have something to talk about, you have something to explain or describe. I understand this is a virtual world. I recognize that these are pigs, even though pigs aren't made of cubes. Joel's asking some really good questions. We'll come back to that, I think, during our Q&A. So that's understand. Moving on to applying within the game, within the Minecraft paradigm. This is where I think the real fun starts, right? Because you're starting to put together the pieces from where you're remembering where things are and how you're understanding what the world around you and the context is. And you're starting to get into the more complex observable behavior and some value judgments potentially. You're starting to integrate these concepts. Hey, I can operate the controls to move around. Okay, there's more to the world than I can just see. I'm choosing to go up this hill instead of walking along this valley. So you're understanding the representations around you and you're applying the skills that you've built within the game to interact more with the game. Moving on to analyzing. So we're moving up the pyramid, up the taxonomy. Even more fun. Now you're asking questions, you're testing hypotheses, you're viewing things from different perspectives, picking apart assumptions, systematically exploring alternatives. Why are all these flowers here on top of the hill? Can I pick them? Or maybe another example from Minecraft is, what happens if I punch this pig? The pig dies. If you haven't played Minecraft, it's a little sad. The first time I played Minecraft, I didn't understand that, and I was sad about the pig. If I tap my mouse while looking at the pig, I run that experiment. I quickly find out what happens, but also I start thinking about the implications, analyzing the results of my action and trying to extrapolate what might be useful about that action and what the downstream consequences and effects would be. RIP. Right. Will I take damage if I fall? Yes. Good question. You're also seeing as I'm going through these, I'm putting some verbs in the bottom, right? It's like question, test, compare, contrast. These things are a little bit more observable, right? Than just analyze or understand. The verbs are the observable things. And that's really where I think the most value comes from for our particular needs. Evaluating, you're deciding the right way to go. Okay. You have this huge world in your Minecraft universe. Justify your decision to yourself or to others, which direction to take. And this can happen really, really fast, but it's still happening, right? I want to go over here because I like the way that those trees look. I want to go over here because I think that might be lava and I want to explore what lava's like in this game. We should build a tower over here because this will give us a good view of the landscape. This hilltop is a good place for me to build a fort because there are a lot of trees nearby, and that's a material that I have access to right now when it comes to fort building. Right. Okay, so that's evaluating, you're arguing, you're justifying, you're defending, you're appraising, and you're sometimes doing that internally, sometimes you're doing it as part of a conversation or as a group. And then creating. So this is a level that integrates all the other levels of Bloom's taxonomy. That's how at least it works in the model. This is about creating a product or developing a new point of view. So this is a screenshot from Westeros Craft. It's an ongoing project, although I think they've been working on it for many, many years now. So there's probably a lot built in there. Basically, their intention was to build all of Westeros from A Song of Ice and Fire. That's Game of Thrones, right? So think about what it takes to make something like this. You need some strategy. What needs to be built? What's our overall vision? How, detailed do we actually want this to be? Why are we going to want it to be that detailed? Communication. How are people going to decide what to work on? Evaluation. What is your definition of done? Who determines that? When do you get feedback? What criteria are you using to make that decision? And there's lots of remembering. Who was working on the Red Keep last week? Uh, did they change the design when they opened, when they launched the new show? Those kinds of things. So the PDF download of the deck will have the link to Westeros Craft if you want to go check out their project site just to kind of poke around at how ridiculous this is. But I include this here because this kind of integrates everything. And you can do this through gameplay. It also doesn't have to be this complex, right? We can make creation a much smaller endeavor than building all of Westeros. It's the verbs, it's the behaviors that we're looking for, and the rest of it is decisions about scope and so on and so forth, other constraints. Okay. So we saw, as each layer in Bloom's taxonomy is associated with a set of verbs, and it's those verbs that are going to help us activate that ROI and help us tell that story. So the examples that I gave, kind of aligned with these. But most models of Bloom's that you'll find online, you've probably bookmarked your favorites. They have a bunch of handy verbs associated with each layer. So when we're talking about connecting gameplay to ROI, that's the piece that will help us make that connection. See what our business leaders are talking about in terms of their active language, and then try to make that connection all the way down the list, step 1, 2, 3, to how that gets expressed in gameplay. Okay, I'm going to take a quick pause here to answer some questions. I saw a lot of conversation happening in the chat. And so I hope some of these questions are actually being answered by the audience. If you have a burning question and I don't get to it and you want to talk to me about it, find me on LinkedIn, or you can email me after the webinar is done and we can totally have a conversation about it. I'm hoping that you're all going to be able to connect with some of other people in the audience in those various platforms. So you can continue the conversation with each other as well. Lots of interesting ideas coming from the chat. So I know that there are good minds behind what we're seeing. Okay, reading the questions down that we've got. I think Ray was asking, most interested to know from the research is if anyone has done studies comparing unscored games, let's say that's a simulation, versus scored games. Is there a measurable improvement in learning outcomes when simulations keep score? I'd say It's my favorite phrase, as it depends. I think that there are some behaviors where you're going to see if you have a particular desired outcome, then having some sort of score may help with that. The thing that's interesting is that when I think about score, I think about numbers. There's often going to be some sort of completion criteria. Sometimes that's, you get to the end of the board faster than somebody else. That might not necessarily be a score, but it is some sort of challenge and there's some sort of indication that the challenge is complete. Okay, I think my microphone just disconnected.
No, we can still hear you,
Okay.
Ellen.
Can you guys still hear me? Yes. Okay, cool. All right. So there's some sort of condition, some sort of win condition. And that win condition basically how the challenge is framed. And if you have a challenge in your game, that is typically a motivational factor, right? People like being, given an objective that they can reach. The thing is in a simulation, you might also have an objective. And so I think you're going to find, you know, there are going to be a lot of games out there that don't have something that you quickly recognize as a score, but still have some sort of challenge and some sort of win condition. And that is important in the game space because of just how people like to interact with that. And so you might see something similar with simulations as well. I'm not aware of any research that looks at that particular question, um, but it'd be really interesting to find it and take a look at what that is. I think whatever that research concludes isn't necessarily something we can generalize to all games or all simulations because it really depends on the design of the individual game or the individual simulation and what you're trying to simulate. This kind of also speaks to Joel's question, how do you distinguish between gameplay and simulation? As a learning designer, I almost don't. Um, to me, the way that I think about how we're setting up the challenge for the learner within the experience, a game is going to have elements of a simulation. And to make a simulation valuable, you might need to have elements of a game, right? You can go into Microsoft Flight Simulator, and it's been many years since I have. The last time I did, it didn't really give me much to work with in terms of challenges. But if you're using Microsoft Flight Simulator in a learning program, you're likely going to have people simulate certain skills in certain conditions. That's your challenge. And so it's not necessarily built into the tool, but it is as an experience a little bit closer to a game because you've given someone a challenge to overcome. So to me, as a learning designer, I don't really think too much about the difference between gameplay and simulation. I think about the constraints that I've been given and the goals that I have for the individual experience that I'm trying to create. And then if it's useful for me to go and try to find a simulation for a given learning experience, then I might do that if I'm looking for something off the shelf. But if I'm actually looking at creating something from scratch, I usually don't think about it in terms of that distinction until I'm being asked to explain what it is to someone else who isn't necessarily on the project. Our scores or winning, losing. So this is from Shu. Our scores or winning, losing, what defines a game? Fun, experience, immersion without points can still be a game. I think a completion condition is what defines a game in the modern context. I think there's a lot of interesting theory around what defines a game, and certainly you can go onto game marketplaces and find things like visual novels that are sold as games but don't necessarily have points. And you can still borrow the patterns and design patterns from that interactivity and use it for yourself. I will say that scores or winning and losing, not necessarily what defines a game, but having a challenge and overcoming it and having something playful along the way is what you're trying to tap into when you're pulling from game design and putting it into a learning context. There are a lot of really well proven, well trod patterns in game design that you can pull into learning experiences to make them meaningful, to make them memorable and motivational, to borrow from Dr. Allen's book. Um, and whether you call it a game or not, it's just dependent on what you think you need to do to get people interested in it and to actually make it valuable. Where does the skill of creating strategically come into the game and become measurable as a learned skill? Yeah, creating strategy. So I think you'd have to be talking about creating strategy within the context of a specific game. You might be interested in looking into something called mega games and learning a little bit more about this, because I think they really get into that. A mega game is like 90 people playing a game at the same time. And part of what they need to do is almost kind of like a model UN situation where they're given a scenario and they have to work together with another 90 people to maneuver through that scenario. And they're doing some strategic work, I think, in those things. I'm not entirely familiar with it, but if you're looking at strategic thinking and modeling that within a game experience, mega games might be a place where you can look for some inspiration. Okay, one more question from Shu, and we're gonna move on. There are a lot of motivations for playing a game, even in a learning context. Does that affect who game-based learning game-based learning module is for? Is there such thing as a one-size-fits-all game-based learning solution? I think that the larger your game gets in terms of its scope, the more avenues for different player preferences and perspectives you need to build in. If you're trying to build something that people are going to log into and play for an hour continuously for 2 weeks at a time, you're going to need to make sure that people have lots of reasons to engage and that you have lots of different reasons to engage. If you have, a 10-minute mini game that's looking at just training or helping people train a specific skill or practice a specific kind of conversation or work through some sort of product knowledge and be able to communicate around that, that can be a lot smaller. And as long as you're making sure that it's relevant to your audience, then you don't necessarily need to have a ton of different motivations built into your design. We could do an entire separate webinar, I think, on like player types and how that might relate to learner preferences. Okay, so let's move forward. We have about 15 minutes left, and so we did answer a bunch of questions. We might cut back a little bit on our questions at the end. I would like to make a stab at doing our group activity, and so what we're going to do is we're going to quickly jump into Mural, and this is a link that's going to be open until after the webinar is closed. So I'll share this link in chat. We'll share it a couple times, and what this is going to do is it's going to bring you to a Mural board where you will be joining as a visitor. Okay, so here's the link. I'm going to put it in chat. And Philip, I'm not sure if there's a better way to share that where everyone will have a
No, that's
have
that's the
that's
that's
the
the
way.
best way. Yep, right now.
Perfect, perfect. Okay, so what we'll probably
Right,
do is we'll probably post that a little bit. I'm
right.
seeing some people move in. Great. Okay, I am going to share my screen now. So even if you're not in the Mural board, you can still see what we're doing. Okay, so let's test drive Mural for a little bit. You can use your scroll wheel if you're on a desktop to zoom in and out. If you are on a laptop with a trackpad, then it's going to give you different prompts for the user experience. There are so many of you. Mural says they can host up to 1,000 simultaneous participants. I think we're going to give it a run for its money today. Oh, someone figured out they can move something. I better lock it. No, bring it back. Okay,
Good job, Ellen. You have to.
fast lock. Okay,
It's
so
amazing what they can find, isn't it?
this is why I love user testing. It's always a fun
Yes.
surprise, a fun adventure. Okay, so we're test driving Mural. I am seeing all sorts of visiting animals. If you want to, if you just want to, if you don't necessarily want to click around, you just want to watch, you can watch on the screen that I'm sharing via Adobe Connect, or you can actually click on my avatar at the bottom of the screen, and then it'll actually just follow me around as I'm moving. Okay, so here, I see you guys have found the icons. That's fantastic. We've got a couple examples of blooms, and what I'd like to do is kind of unlock a couple examples for you. So I will remove this in a second. You guys are probably just going to jump right in and go ahead and do it. So I'm going to remove our screen here and just kind of unlock this. So what I've done here is I've kind of just created some space for you guys to try to add in some of your own ideas about what these learning objectives would be. I am going to ask that you do not post pictures of Dexter. Thank you. And so if you want to try to kind of just reproduce the kind of the steps that we've been looking at this time or throughout this particular hour. I put another example over here. Think back to the example we had about the Beamser 3000 earlier. We're looking at an organizational goal. We're looking at learning objectives, analyzing. We're looking at optimal troubleshooting and communication steps. And then we're looking at, what we might think about for a gameplay objective. Now, the example on the left is completely built out. The examples 2 and example 3 here are not. So you have an organizational goal, but we need to think about what a realistic learning objective would be for this organizational goal. And I'm glad that we're kind of unleashing chaos here because there are so many of you. I'm hoping that if we do some of this together, then we'll get some good ideas, but some different ideas from each of you for each of these categories. So while you guys are kind of going through and putting out some ideas, I'm going to zoom in here and I'm going to start working on example 2 and just kind of think through that for a couple of minutes. Again, this board is going to be open and we'll keep an eye on it over the next few days. So you can come in here and see what other ideas are popping up from other people. And if you are posting pictures of fictional serial killers, I will remove them. Although I do like that show. Okay, so organizational goal, increase sales conversions for a new SaaS product by 15% this year. You might also see something like increased penetration rates. I think that's a really good example of something that else is similar. Scrolling down here, what kind of learning objective would be realistic to align with that organizational goal? We've got differentiate, okay, explain the process. Interesting, okay. Very good. I'm thinking when I think about realistic learning objectives for this goal, I'm thinking, that we need to probably train our salespeople on specific skills regarding their conversations with customers. There might be more to it, right? We'll probably have to do some analysis and really figure out what the needs are. Is it an issue of talking about the product with customers, or is it just an issue of identifying the right customers to talk to and investing our effort in the right ways, right? We can't necessarily take it all at face value, but we can come up with a few different hypotheses and then use those hypotheses to kind of execute the exercise here. Identify reasons for customer churn. Oh, that's fascinating. I'm going to zoom way in on this blue one here. Define the characteristics of customers likely to purchase the product, right? So who are your target customers? I really like that. Be able to explain the differences, maybe the differences between your product and a competitor's product. I like that a lot. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. I found it. I'm very glad. I'm not sure what it was, but you found it. Counter objections, really, really good one. Okay. So add troubleshooting tables. Okay, this is good. So this is interesting. What I'm seeing here is a lot of different potential learning objectives, which could then be used to generate a lot of different types of gameplay, which I think is fascinating, right? Because when you look at kind of the way that skills get executed out in the world, we're never really just relying on one. Sometimes we have to train that way. Sometimes we have to organize our programs in that sort of way. But usually someone is being, is performing because they're integrating a lot of different skills. Okay, let's take a minute to go over here and look at example 3. So example 3, reduce observed violations of workplace safety protocols by 25% in the next 6 months. It's a little bit more specific. What would a realistic learning objective for this organizational goal be? Identify workplace safety protocol violations. Yeah, I've seen a lot of different activities like that where you maybe got a timer and you've got to identify all, the violations that are present in a virtual space. Or maybe you're doing it in a classroom and people are competing maybe in teams based on images. A lot of different ways that I've seen that in the past. Recognize what qualifies as a workplace violation. Fun. And then gameplay objective. Can you imagine gameplay that would achieve the learning objective? Describe it with those good verbs. Okay, so this is interesting. Scenario-based learning, a possible branching activity simulation. I think that's really fascinating because you could totally explore, all right, here's a safety violation. What are the consequences of it? What could happen? This again, though, we're using the language of type and category to talk about the game. So within this scenario-based learning, within this branching activity simulation, what are the verbs people are doing, right? They're selecting the available option that leads to the worst outcome. Well, that would be interesting. I'm not sure you'd be able to get that through compliance review, but it would be interesting for a game. Yeah, select safe versus unsafe behavior. I could see that. You almost have like two cards or something like that, or you could definitely have some sort of comparison game like that. Yeah, okay. Detect violations or identify them. And you fill them out like in a basket. That's interesting. I really love that. Yeah, kind of like a collection mechanic. This is really creative. Okay. Um, I am going to uh I am going to stop sharing. We're going to go back to the platforms. We only have a couple minutes left. Okay, again, we're going to leave that open. I'm sure some of you will be kind of focused on that for the rest of the session, but we only have a few minutes left. So just to kind of bring it home for everybody, the thing that I wanted to talk to you today is just go through in specific how we can use Bloom's taxonomy and the rich language that has developed around that tool to connect the ROI that the business is looking for to specific gameplay that learners will find interesting, and the business will also find, or the organization will also find valuable. So, if you want to remember, if you want to connect your game based learning experiences to organizational ROI, and you want to talk about the benefits of a game, you need to use verbs. Okay. So I am going to, in the last couple of minutes, Philip, are there any wrap up comments that we want to make time for, or do we have a couple minutes for one or two more questions?
We have a couple minutes for one or two more questions, so please go ahead. We have a couple in the parking lot over here, as you can see from earlier.
Yeah. Okay. I see that, but we have one from Kevin and we have another one from Joel. So Kevin was asking, they're new to the area of gamification. How can you build games into manufacturing machines? Now that is really fascinating. There is an author that I have found really useful thinking about gamification. And that's where you're taking game design patterns and applying them to real world contexts, as opposed to game based learning where you're building a game for learning purposes. I think sometimes it can feel like a distinction without a difference, but that's typically how I have used the terms in different ways. The author I'm talking about is Yukai Chao. And Yukai Chao looks at human behavior in this octalysis framework. And he looks at different core motivations, core drives that motivate people to do things. And so, if you're looking at actually gamifying the workplace and the tools that people are using, um, that might be a good place for you to do some reading and do some research. I'm not a big fan of his writing style, but I really like the octalysis framework because I think it opens up, it's kind of a good canvas to work on. Okay, Joel asked, how do generational differences come into this discussion? Some generations have never played, some live on games. How do you take generation into account? That is a really good question. I think rather than relying on generation, which is kind of a heuristic, you need to actually learn about your specific audience. I know some of the most avid gamers that I work with are in their 60s. And I know some people who are, Gen Z who just really aren't into it. They'd rather read a book. They're not actually into games that much. So you're going to always find exceptions. The thing that you need to think about when you're designing for your audience is to what degree are your exceptions, right? You can't rely only on the generalization to give you the answers that you need to actually design for your context. But there is a lot of information out there from the gaming industry about which age ranges tend to play which games. And that might be a good place for you to start with some of your hypotheses. But then remember to poke at the edges because, we need to be looking at our own individual populations to really determine what's going to work for them. Okay. So we're
Great.
pretty much at time, Philip. Hand it back to
I
you.
Oh, wow. I mean, that a lot of great information here, and now it just changed the layout. So please rate today's session, and also thank you, Ellen. There's a contact information. This is also in the handout for today. And if you didn't get the handout already downloaded, it will post with today's recording a little bit later today in Training Magazine Network. So please rate the session, put in your most useful ideas or takeaways. Look at all the hearts and applause that are floating around, Ellen. Very good. And also, what other topics, and it could be related to today's topic, would you like to see? There's three three available things for you to enter, and actually a fourth with a regular chat. If you still want to sneak in maybe a last moment question for Ellen, and the recording is going to continue here if we run a little bit over. But Ellen, what a great and thought provoking session here today, and it was fun using Mural for sure, and seeing that in operation. I'm also going to launch on most people's browsers right now a little bit more about ELB's custom game page, and there is also, let me show you here, Ellen. We still have you live on video. Or the video's gone rather, but we still have you live on audio for the training arcade games page. You can book a demo today with ELB Learning. So make sure you take advantage of that right now. And there is still time here to put in chat your most useful idea or takeaway. And don't forget, you can print out a certificate of participation here too. Ellen, a lot to think about, a lot of colors today too.
Yeah, maybe there's a reason they limit it to 1,000 people on Mural.
Right.
Yeah, but no, I really appreciated the chat today. There's a lot of theory we can talk about when it comes to applying games to different serious quote unquote contexts, but ultimately, game development's about experimentation. Build
Right.
fast, build small, test things, get feedback, um, and then you have something, quick and real that you can actually build upon.
Absolutely. And how long did you say that the mural will be open?
I'll probably leave it open for another few days, maybe till the end of the week.
Uh,
So if people have time over their, for 15 minutes just to come in and either add more ideas or let things simmer for a day and then go back and see what other people have put. I'll
Great.
be checking in a couple times each day just to make sure things stay focused.
All right. Well, I want to say thank you to all of our members and for participating and bringing forth a lot of very good banter and exchange of ideas in chat, and for your questions today. Ellen, I know that we'll have to have you back as this landscape isn't going away anytime soon, right? And
Thank goodness.
ever evolving. So thank you again for attending today's event. Ellen, what a great session here again for Training Magazine Network. Thank you.